Hello, one and all, and welcome to the Media Beat with Maureen and Claire. And welcome to number 82, but it's a very special episode because we're not just with Maureen and Claire. Today, we welcome back our first guest that is returning, and it is Dr. Alex Connock, who was with us a couple of years ago. So we are very, very excited to get on and have the conversation with Alex. But just to remind you, he is a producer turned academic. He's now teaching AI and media at both Oxford and Exeter, universities thereof. And he was on the Media Beat nearly 2 years ago, and it really doesn't feel like that. One of our most listened to episodes. And at the time, Alex had a book out called Media Management and Artificial Intelligence, and we did a deep dive into that. It was a fascinating episode. I still remember it. Now, you will probably be aware, unless you've been living under a rock on Mars in another solar system, that both AI and the influence on the media industry have moved on at extraordinary speed since late 2022. Dr. Alex has been pretty busy in the meantime and has created a new book which is just out at the moment from Routledge, and the title of the book is Entrepreneurship in Media and Entertainment. So this explores how AI, creativity and entrepreneurship are reshaping every stage of the media business, from startup to scale up to crisis management to exits, etc. And we'll be diving into that in a few moments. So we'll be talking to Alex about what the transformation really looks like in practice, how AI is changing storytelling, production, talent and education, and what the next generation of media entrepreneurs need to know to stay ahead. And if that doesn't pique your interest, nothing will. But I'll hand over to Claire, because you're going to kick off and ask Alex the first question.
That was a masterful introduction, Oliver. Thank you very much. And we are delighted to have you back, Alex. It's brilliant. The last time you came on, we all learned so much and we all started playing with ChatGPT. But of course, as Oliver said, things have changed quite a lot. I think when you came on, the first version of ChatGPT had just been made public and people were starting to create poetry and all sorts of things on it. What's happened? Just give us a little bit of where are we in this sort of industrial landscape? What's changed in terms of volume of investment, in terms of where we are in the cycle?
Well, I think that thank you very, very much for having me, by the way. I'm delighted to be back, and I'm slightly intimidated by the fact that I'm the first returner. I better sort of deliver on that. I think if we take it at a real meta level, first of all, it's the sheer volume of investment. So if you take the top four companies, which is kind of Microsoft, Meta, Google, and Amazon, they're investing roughly every 3 to 4 days the entire market value of ITV. So that's the kind of level of the money that's going into this. Yeah. And Jensen Huang, who is, as you know, is the boss of NVIDIA, said, look, what we're building here is kind of factories in the sky, a factory that makes AI. And if you think about it, that's a really good point, because we've now have access to this kind of production facility that sits nebulously somewhere up in the sky that we can all draw upon to produce whatever we want, basically. And you're right that when we started with ChatGPT back in December of 2022, we could make poetry, and I was very pleased with myself with making some sort of facsimile of a Shakespeare sonnet or what have you. But now, in October 2025, we have Sora 2, and people are making kind of videos of police arrests of SpongeBob SquarePants and what have you. And many of them are entirely credible. I'm getting sort of caught out by some of them. And that's a completely different transformed landscape. And I think what's happened is that actually the AI has now become the default paradigm of how you start a company. In fact, I was listening to an interview the other day with Nikolai Tangen, who's the head of Norway's public investment fund, which, as you will know, is like a $2 trillion fund. It's the biggest investment fund in the world. It's what they did with their North Sea oil that we should have done instead of spending it all. And he said, it's interesting because there are very few cases where a compliance officer could kill a company. But if you hold back the usage of AI, you kill your company because competition is going so fast. I think that's a really interesting point, because what it means is that even the people who are definitively and sort of intentionally not embracing AI are not taking a risk-free decision. On the contrary, they're actually potentially putting their company in jeopardy because there's this kind of incredible productivity moving around you that will change the competitive situation in which you find yourself. So that's the big picture. And then if you sort of play that out into kind of production of TV shows, let's say, and I know this is a media podcast rather than specifically TV one, but that actually plays out here. And I think there's sort of 3 or 4 different models in TV of how people are approaching this. And there's one that I would call the kind of indie flex. I think the best example of that is Hattrick Lab. And Hattrick went out and employed several of my graduates from the National Film School where I was teaching, really bright guys, to start a kind of startup AI and live entertainment focused. I mean, come back to the nexus between those two, but AI and entertainment focused startup within Hattrick. Then you've got the kind of broadcaster pivot, and you've got kind of ITV, BBC, Fox Studios. Rob from Fox Studios told me he has the AI office, the AI team right outside his office to kind of make the point. So they're doing that, and they've really kind of got some momentum over the last few months with that, having been quite timid about it before because of their fear of the unions. And then you've got the kind of pure play indies who are really all in on AI. And I'd say Deep Fusion are a really good example of that. Those are the guys who did the Michael Parkinson facsimile, and they're getting a lot of play. And then you've got some sort of pure play tech stuff as well. So again, another graduate of mine from National Film has started a company called Amara, which is a kind of video synthesis tool. And so you've got kind of 3 or 4 different models of how people are grappling with this fact. And I'll just finish by one little comment, which is that I was doing a session at Oxford the other day with an investment banker who said 75% of all the world's venture capital investment is going into AI companies. And to a certain extent, if you're not an AI company, you're not a company now. I think that's a really interesting point, is that if you're going to pitch a business proposition now, you have to have an AI plan, because if you don't, you're essentially discounted.
That's slightly terrifying and really fascinating. Before we go into, as you say, the little bit more in depth in the ecosystem and what people are doing and how you can really use AI to your benefit, I was just wondering, and this is something that came up in a meeting I was in. I now use AI all the time. I use Perplexity essentially instead of Google, but sometimes I do wonder when I put into Perplexity, how many grams are in an ounce. And I think about the computing power that goes into answering that question compared to just a simple Google search. It does feel like maybe we're using a lot of energy to boil a cup of tea. I mean, is that something that is there an issue there with computing power?
Yeah, but it's interesting because I've done maybe 50 or 100 sort of industry sessions over the last year. I mean, really a lot. And every single one, someone will ask that question. And of course, the answer, like almost every answer in AI, is kind of yes and no simultaneously. So yes, it's definitely true that generative AI uses a tremendous amount of compute power and therefore causes potentially environmental damage. But it's also true that AI is potentially going to solve many environmental questions, for example, around nuclear fusion, around optimization of wind turbines and what have you. So there are 2 sides to the equation, and that's a recurring theme in AI, because you find the same thing in job losses and job creation, for example, and in creativity itself. On the one hand, the loss of creative jobs, and on the other hand, the boost to creativity that enables us to do all these crazy things with Gen AI. So yes, I think it's true. And actually, funny enough, this morning I proposed a course specifically on energy and AI. I think that's a really interesting course, sort of climate MBA type of course, which I suspect would be pretty well subscribed because the issues are so complex and so interesting.
Adding to that, Alex, because I was listening to a Bloomberg interview the other day, and I was staggered to hear that. I think we know about this, but Bezos is leading the charge. Of course, Musk is leading the charge, and there is the prospect of taking these data centers up into space, because of course it's cold and there's plenty of space too. Do you give any credence to that could be the next level or layer of activity and funding to solve the problem with capacity and costs and compute issues that we're facing now? Because, as you say, if you ain't doing AI, you ain't a company.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know the answer to that question, if I'm really honest. I don't know the kind of cost benefit analysis of taking sort of GPUs into space. I think that's one of the things one should cover on a course. Is like, what are the maths of it? I think the only thing I would counsel or just suggest is that no reductive, simplistic answers are ever correct in this game. And I think that what one needs to do is kind of come to the equation with the full externalities of what is being suggested. And that, it may be that by the time you add in this, here's an interesting example. When people talk about TV shoots, and they say, oh, you mustn't use AI to create images. I always say, well, yeah, but if you're going to actually go and blow up a building, which was the famous sequence in the Netflix show, that's going to probably have a much bigger environmental damage than spending 200 tokens on Runway ML to make a bit of an image of a building blowing up. So you have to weigh both sides of the equation. I'm certainly not here to say AI is not damaging the environment or couldn't potentially damage the environment. I am here to say it's complicated.
And taking you back to, which I think is fascinating, the way you've approached AI because a company will need to be AI, basically, what's the word? Savvy, AI savvy. Otherwise, they get nil point for valuation. If you take us back to some of the examples that you made, it was sort of legacy production company hat trick with the Indiflex, of course ITV, BBC as well, and then Deep Fusion, which is really interesting. Ben Field in particular has launched that. But that's old guard trying to ensure and defend themselves and future proof themselves. If you stay with though the now environment, the Ben Fields or the Deep Fusions, how are you thinking about either the creative economy or AI as in the form of native startups? Is there anything particular about what they may be doing that others are not doing? Because AI clearly is spawning so many different companies. I mean, you can pick up an iPhone, 16 and shoot and point and maybe get a Fuji and maybe get, a small camera, and there you are, you're a producer. What's your view and how are you approaching this idea of startups and AI? Is it different from yesteryear?
Yeah, I just think as ever in AI, there are two different paradigms in sort of competition with each other. So the one is, as you kind of mentioned, the paradigm of the creator economy, where you have the kind of very fleet-footed, newly launched startup making the most of these incredible Gen AI tools that are now built into TikTok and YouTube and other places, almost zero production cost, super scalable, some of them doing really well, and that model playing out to a certain extent in the legacy kind of old media world of TV production, but also playing out much more widely in the creator economy and marketing. And I saw a statistic today that I think 92% of marketers are either already using Gen AI for content creation or intend to within the next 6 months. But on the other hand, there's also an opposite kind of paradigm, which is that all creators, all the kind of legacy creators are now kind of Louis Vuitton. They're all kind of luxury goods because AI can do Primark. And so if you really want to stand out, you have to have some kind of luxury human creative, some sort of special sauce attached to your delivery that in a funny sort of way is not AI, but it's something else entirely. And so I'm not saying that the entire model should be all in on AI. I'm saying that the model needs to be AI informed, but actually the equity value in a business may be the human creativity that's ultimately driving it. I think that's been really interesting when I've done talks recently. I did a big talk with, I think they won't mind me saying, with ITV, and I talked to a lot of their drama producers, and I was essentially saying this, of saying, you're the creative geniuses and it will ever be thus, but there is this amazing toolkit now that you can use that will facilitate you in being creatively excellent and does not necessarily challenge the idea that you are ultimately the creator.
Well, you said that last time you were there, and that really stuck with me, that your job's not going to be replaced by AI, but it will be replaced by somebody using AI, which I think is still what we're talking about.
Yeah. There's other fabulous stuff here. I mean, I was listening to an interview with Sam Altman this morning, and as you know, one of the big issues in AI is copyright, and lots of creators around the world are incredibly exercised about the fact that AI systems have obviously ripped off their content in order to create content. And Sam Altman, far from being apologetic about that, said he has had plenty of calls from creators over the last couple of days since he launched Sora 2, which is their new video model, begging that they be upped in the algorithms such that their characters and their content be featured more in the generative AI outputs. So once again, a complete paradox where the whole creative industry is up in arms about being trained upon, and the people doing the training is saying, but you're also calling us and saying you want to be featured more. I don't know how much to believe of that, but it's certainly a fascinating point.
Well, that was definitely the case for YouTube in the early days, so I believe it for sure. Sorry, Maureen, go ahead.
I was going to say to that point as well. I think it was a week ago when Sam Altman said to Hollywood, "Okay, now if you disagree with Sora 2 and the characters that it's producing, i.e., Darth Vader or Mickey Mouse, then you need to send me a letter to tell me to stop doing it." And of course, I think this was a PR stunt because then I think that really helped promote Sora 2. And then I think four days later, he's retrenched and said, "Oh, I'm only kidding. You don't. You can opt in instead." And I think that's why he's getting so many letters from creators to say, "Please, you can use my identity. You can use anything that any of my IP, but let's participate in possibly a revenue share." So I love the fact that this flexibility, and he's embracing the creator community, and he's probably going to be embracing Hollywood again by saying you can share in the proceeds, you can share in the upside. But I wonder how the lawyers are going to deal with that. And of course, I think yesterday the the New York Times versus OpenAI just kicked off as well in the courts. So it'd be kind of interesting to see how that pans out around copyright infringement. But anyway,
There are so many challenges. Like I was looking at Netflix's generative AI terms. So they have this kind of document, a guide for creators as how to use generative AI. And they say a couple of things that really leap off the page. One is they say, yeah, it's fine to use generative AI just in the ideation phase, but don't use it for the final output. And the problem I think with that is, let's say I'd sent them a science fiction drama and I said, here's the interior of the spaceship, and I'd asked Midjourney to do that, the generative AI tool. I might give them a spaceship that looked an awful lot like Ridley Scott's Alien spaceship because that's what it'd been trained on. And then I might say to my set designers, go and build that. And so even though I just used it in the ideation, I'd end up putting something on screen that was copyright compromised. But then at the bottom of Netflix, this kind of traffic light system that they have, they say, oh, by the way, you can't use any Gen AI that's been trained on any Netflix data. And so I created an AI agent to go and just like use all the existing tools that are out there, the kind of large language models, and just say, can you create me some content that's derivative of Stranger Things? And off it went and just produced these incredibly obviously derivative of Stranger Things documents. The point being, of course, that all content everywhere coming out of LLMs has been trained on Netflix. And therefore, essentially, you can't make stuff for Netflix using Gen AI.
So Alex, in your view, just again staying with maybe the sustainability of a startup, then, given that there's so much cash out there going to be thrown at so many of these fantastic startups, do you think sustainability is going to be around the business model innovation itself, the fluency in which you know how to use the tools, or simply just, as you say or said earlier, the creative instinct, or is it going to be a combination of all? What's going to be?
It's very interesting because there has definitely been a sea change in production. So again, like you, I'm sure I've been around a lot of creative companies in the last 6 months. I think at the beginning of that 6 month period, so at the beginning of 2025, it was quite rare for them to say, oh yeah, we're actually using Gen AI right now in our production process in any meaningful way. But fast forward to September 2025, and you'll be in the office of a production company and they will say, oh yeah, that team over there, they're actually using Runway ML or, Google Gemini or whatever tool it is. They're really operationalizing it, as we speak. And that's true of big broadcasters and smaller entities. And you mentioned the lawyers earlier. I think the lawyers have gone from a position of kind of absolute arms folded rejection of the whole idea of using this stuff to a much more kind of pragmatic and risk-based approach where they're going, yeah, there are some tools you can use and some that you can't. Just tell us what you're doing and be transparent about it and they'll be fine. The other thing is that people are using it everywhere with or without the permission of the company. I was talking to one very big public sector body in the UK. I was talking to the guy who had been brought in to run AI. On day one, the board had said to him, just to let you know, no one's using AI here yet. So you're here on the right day, just to really make sure you set some compliance protocols in place. He went, okay. He went to the head of IT and said to the head of IT, are there any AI tools being used? It was 125 different AI tools had been used that day already in the company. The point is that everyone's already using this. So I think what we're going to see is just an operationalization of these tools at every level, startup, broadcaster, newspaper company, you name it. And the ones that win will be the ones that manage to combine the production efficiencies of AI tools, the kind of 40% saving on post-production and what have you, and the fantastical distribution advantages that you get through algorithmic marketing of all kinds, reinforcement learning most particularly, that combine that with the old school storytelling that you would have found in 1965 in a great production company. And those two things have to sit side by side.
And can I ask about that? Because I'm just fascinated by this 125 AI tools, because this is what I see as well. You go into a company and everybody's using AI, as in the same way that, everybody's using Google. It's that level. How do you then enforce any sort of governance around it? Because you do need some, you were talking about lawyers, etc. Obviously, you can't stop it, but there needs to be some guidelines, some governance, especially when we're dealing with creative and IP. Is that something that you've come across? Are there models out there that people can think about?
Yes, funnily, I've looked at the compliance protocols of many leading production companies, broadcasters, government departments around the world. They're all published, and they're all actually really good as a rule. And there are also a couple of places like the Turing Institute where they're actually aggregated. So what you don't have to do is invent from scratch a compliance scenario. Actually, from the British government, the Canadian government, from big broadcasters, you can grab these things off the shelf and then flex them to your model. I think the ones that I've seen that have worked really well have been where people from all levels of the business were brought into the process so that it didn't become a top-down diktat, but became a kind of an organically representative set of kind of agreed policy protocols. And I think that that is how successful organizations are managing this. So they're saying, it really does concern the receptionist as much as it concerns the finance team and so forth. And so let's make sure a representative of every team and every department is involved in the creation of those protocols, and let's allow for transparency. And then I think the other thing is let's allow for test and learn. And so let's not be too punitive about people who get things wrong, which we all do. Let's allow for a kind of process of transparency whereby if someone does a tool that doesn't quite work, or there's some legal issue comes up, whatever it is, there's not so much punishment that people have to do it kind of under the radar and under their desk. But in fact, they're able to be transparent and open about it. And that probably is how the organization will learn.
I think added to that as well, I was at a seminar, and Adobe came in to talk specifically about their product suite. And they were saying, look, if you're using our product suite for your workflows, everything you do within Adobe is indemnified. Your enterprise agreement, fine. So they're really being quite open about this. But if you start to use Runway and you go and bring it into your workflow, then be careful. You're probably not indemnified. So I love the fact that openness, because they also don't want their to pee off their clients when something goes wrong. So I love that. I love seeing that as well. So
there's one other dimension, which is, of course, thus far we've been talking about Gen AI, which is a huge topic, but it's a small topic in the context of the much bigger field of machine learning. And there's lots of machine learning that's been present in broadcasting for kind of 17 years, really, since Netflix got involved with supervised learning back in like 2007 and 2008. And actually, many of those techniques are completely uncontroversial, the ones that involve the distribution of advertising, for example, but they can even find their way into editorials. So recently, I've been looking at kind of areas of editorial content in sort of print and other forms of media, TV, which would be fantastically improved by the application of machine learning. And actually, if you look at the New York Times that you mentioned, they're interested in that field to do, and they've done a deal with Amazon to do that. So special ones I've seen are animal translation, a fabulous field where people are, translating dolphins, talking to elephants, listening to whales, and so forth. One little bit of research that would radically transform natural history TV forever, and possibly other aspects of society, including our food chain, if we could understand what animals are saying. Other sort of tiny little corners of it, like underwater footage correction. So I saw a Chinese academic paper where someone had figured out how to take the water out of underwater footage. And you might say, well, that sounds quite dull. But actually, if you think about it, suddenly it opens up the field of like looking at every footage of every wreck that's ever been shot in the world and making incredible shows about it, for example. And then the other thing, I think satellite data is really interesting. And so I think factual coverage, journalism of all kinds, investigative journalism can be massively improved and kind of made more substantive if you're able to use satellite data to create your own statistics from primary sources. How many swimming pools are there in the area? How much is this supermarket attendance in this area? And so on and so forth. What crops are being grown and so forth. So I think many, many areas of editorial life, if you wanted to put it like that, which can be improved with AI techniques, which are nothing to do with Gen AI and can be actually rather uncontroversial.
Well, I want 100% correct, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens to documentaries, for instance, in this new world once people really embrace the technology. But going back to Gen AI or creative AI, my son's just started at university, and he's starting an English degree, and the first mandatory reading he was given is a book called More Than Words, How to Think About Writing in the Age of AI, which I think is pretty good, actually, of the university to start with that. But it's, I haven't read it, but apparently it's very interesting. I wonder, if you're a creative today, if you're a writer, or a director or anybody that's involved on the creative side of the media industry, how do you think about this? Do you lie down and forget your dreams of becoming, the new Stanley Kubrick, or do you embrace AI? I mean, how would you advise new creators? You work with the NFTs. How would you advise new creators to think about their future in this world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult one because I think it would be sort of facile to say no traditional creative profession is going to be affected by this technology. That's not true. But it's also not true to say that there will be no creative jobs in the future. So I think that there's probably an evolution taking place before our very eyes towards a different suite of jobs, which is not the same suite of jobs that was there when, say, the entertainment unions were created, but which is nonetheless a substantial range of jobs. And I think if you refer to the NFTS, it's quite interesting because when I first started talking about AI at the NFTS, I think in 2023, I was met with some sort of raised eyebrows, both from staff and students, and no one really was taking it that seriously. I mean, some people were, but most people weren't. But if you look, by the time of 2024's class graduated, a good percentage, meaning like 50%, were actually talking about going into AI created content. And there'd been a kind of real paradigm shift there. And I think that's probably true of the industry at large, is that a younger generation are not saying this impinges upon our creativity and creative agency. On the contrary, they're kind of saying we can be creative with this, but we need to take ownership of it, and both economically and as producers, such that the outputs are owned by us in both senses as well. So I'm not entirely pessimistic. If you look at the academic literature and the kind of research on this, again, that cuts both ways. Lots of research says that certain jobs across the whole economy, not just entertainment, are going to be challenged, and that other jobs aren't, notably blue-collar jobs, generally speaking, aren't. But then also at the same time, there's plenty of research to show that that process is quite slow, it's not universal across all roles, and other jobs are being created. So where that balance will end up is not a fact that's known yet. And so it's too facile and simplistic to say, oh yeah, AI is going to destroy an industry or what have you. It's much more complicated than that.
Where do you see, going to that point, where do you see levels of adoption greater than others if you look at if you step back and look at the media value chain? And that might also, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your book in particular, where you're approaching the sort of 7 stages of a company's lifespan as well. I think that's going to be really interesting to maybe dovetail. But where are you seeing the most adoption, and where are you seeing more and too much resistance? And what are those challenges and issues?
Yeah, so look, let me try and answer both those questions together. So the way I did it in my book is I sort of was thinking about what's the life journey of an entrepreneurial company, and obviously there's 100 ways you could describe that. I just did it in 7, which is startup, ideas, talent, technology, marketing, scale up, and exit. Essentially, kind of that's the journey. And I think that it's definitely true to say actually that in the marketing industry in general and in the marketing phase of startups, that's where AI is first and biggest for sure. I saw a survey the other day that a colleague at Oxford had run, and he'd asked marketers, what was the biggest thing in marketing? And they all, the great majority had said AI. I mentioned earlier that 90% of marketers are expecting to use Gen AI in the next 6 months. And if you think about who owns the marketing industry now, essentially Google and Meta, subject to some sort of small player like WPP in the equation, but they are relatively small. Actually, those are companies that are achieving the excellence in distribution of marketing and the kind of personalization and contextual personalization entirely through sort of algorithmic distribution using things like reinforcement and supervised learning and lots of other things. And so marketing is where I think we've seen it first. And I think that we're also seeing that in, cinema, TV, music, very much so, and so forth. I think if you go to the kind of the creative phase or the kind of ideation phase, I would say it's certainly around ideas now. We're starting to see people using AI systematically in the creation and particularly the development of ideas. Not exclusively, and they probably never will do exclusively, but because human ideas are kind of a luxury good now, as I mentioned. But I think that's where you're seeing it. So I think in those 2 particular areas, if you look at the film and TV and to a certain extent commercials production as well, industry specifically, I think you're seeing quite a lot of people looking at post-production processes. And so I've been to quite a lot of conferences, and I'm sure you have too, where people have said, look, we can achieve roughly a 40% cost saving on the aggregate post-production cost of this business. And so when I've been to TV companies, I've said, look, you don't have to embrace this. And we appreciate you need to be sensitive. But if someone's going in straight after you to pitch for the same slot and they have a 40% advantage over a post-production bill that will be roughly 50% of the budget, that means they're 20% cheaper than you. And you better be really good if you can beat someone systematically when they're 20% cheaper than you. And so I think that's where we're seeing it. Interesting, though, it's complicated. It's complicated in a couple of ways. First of all, there was a really interesting project that Edit Cloud did for ITV, where they looked very consciously at the workflow of post-production and how you could industrialize that with AI. Because it's one thing for me to use Runway or whatever to make a clip. It's quite a different thing to make a series of Big Brother. And they found that they were stringing together up to 10 or 15 different AI tools in order to achieve achieve that workflow. So it's going to be complicated. It's going to be really complicated, and we're not there yet. But I think it's certainly heading in that direction.
Are you seeing people emerging that are actually putting these packages together, sort of, creating suites of products?
Absolutely, you're seeing that. I mean, I had a list of AI applications that pertain to media, and I got to 13,000 and gave up. But there are some excellent tools out there. There are tools that allow you to do things like have a chat GPT style interaction with your edit material. So you can do contextual inquiries. You can say things like, can you find me all the shots where the woman in the red dress is talking to a man across the road, or whatever it might be, or where the blue car is driving down the road. And that will save a lot of time. But of course, that's not the same thing as creating a finished and finessed storytelling in a drama. And so I've talked to quite a lot of editors who've said, actually, what the AI could do and will do is populate the timeline. It'll do kind of the first week of the edit, but that's the most boring week, actually. And where the storytelling really comes into its own, and where the process of being a great editor comes in, is in selecting from 60 cameras worth of a Big Brother shoot to make an actual proper story out of that. And so, it may not be that the human is out of the equation. It may simply be that AI is doing some of the mechanical stuff, allowing the humans to be more scrupulous and discerning.
And Alex, I'm always fascinated by these numbers, like 40% optimization, especially given we know these tools are really complicated and it does take time to understand, use them. And we know a lot of people have complained you just can't just press the button saying generate and boom, it happens. You have to work really hard. And so there is time that it takes to really create something really quite spectacular. So if you've got that, and then you've got, so many new tools coming through, this missing element of training, where's the cost of this training? Who is doing the training? Is it now left to corporates, or is it the likes of yourself and your institutions, that are having to sort of teach and breed the new talent that will enter the media and entertainment industry?
Let me take that on two levels, tools and teaching. So on the tools, actually, there's some quite interesting thought now. You mentioned the stochastic nature of AI outputs. In other words, if I ask the same prompt twice, I did it with Jackson Pollock McDonald's, McDonald's picture of McDonald's by Jackson Pollock. And I created loads of different videos for the same exact prompt. The point being that each time you ask the same question, you get a different answer. That's hellish if you're creating a thing. But actually, what people are saying now is that maybe what we do is we use the AI for an initial creative blast, get some interesting imagery, and then we use something like Unity or Unreal Engine, which are kind of linear deterministic computer programs which will produce the same output with the same question each time. And so we tie an AI to some other mechanical pre-existing tool to create something much more usable and much more kind of discerning across a drama where we need consistency across 600 shots in an hour-long drama or what have you. In terms of the teaching, I think it's really interesting because when we started at Oxford, we were running these kind of generalist AI programs. And I think in the first year we did a diploma, postgrad diploma, back in 2021, I think it was. I think we had 27 people on the diploma. And we were teaching kind of across the board AI stuff, astronomy to zoology, kind of thing. And now that course, I think, has 2 cohorts of 80 per year. So it's multiplied by 7 or something. But actually what people are doing now is going vertical specific. And they're saying it's basically impossible and pointless to try and teach people everything from how to fly a plane using AI to how to, make plastic toys. They're just different topics. And AI is so imbued into everything. It doesn't really make sense anymore. But what does make sense is teaching post-production in film and television or in music or music distribution or whatever it might be, or classical music, composing and what have you. And so I think you're starting to see a lot of vertical specific AI teaching, both in the industry from lots of the industry bodies like Screen Island, Screen Skills, all these people, so they're all offering those courses. NFTS does as well, but also in universities now. And because of course the students are super AI literate and are sort of lapping this stuff up. And so I teach at one university, I teach a specific vertical AI course just on the media, and that's very well attended. It's something like 350 students choosing to do it every year. So that Gen Z audience, whilst they're simultaneously threatened by AI because it's supposedly mechanizing all the white collar jobs, although I'm not entirely sure that's true, they're also embracing it. They're the most literate in it. And there's actually the boss of Amazon, Andy Jassy, said, why would you not hire Gen Zs? Because they're the people who really know how to use AI, our kids, essentially.
one of the things, just picking up on the education, I'd love to see your view on this. One of the things people say about AI is that the problem is, it, as you said yourself about the post-production, it removes the first boring step, which is the step people use to learn. So if you're, if you're a lawyer, if you're a junior lawyer, you're going to learn how to become a lawyer by doing doing all the research. But now you don't need to do this anymore because AI does it for you. So how do you learn and then become a better editor, a better lawyer, etc.? And how do we square that circle when it comes to AI and I guess learning on the job?
I think it's a great question, and I don't have an answer. I think I've actually I've just written a lecture on this very topic for my New York's course, and I specifically looked at that question, and I specifically don't have an answer to it. That's not quite the same thing as me saying it's inevitable, that's going to happen, those kids are not going to get jobs or anything like that. It's just that I don't have a definitive percentage answer as to what percentage of white collar jobs are going to be lost and at what level they're going to be and so forth. The answer probably lies in that question sort of assumes a steady state economy where there's the same number of lawyers doing the same things. And actually, probably the reality is that lawyers themselves as a whole will start doing different things, more strategic and tactical things. And some of the rote work will indeed be taken by AI. But of course, the defense against that is not to not have any AI in your law firm, because all that will happen then is the work will go to another law firm. So it's tricky. It's really tricky. It's not a simple equation.
If you think of let's say a TV production, you're shooting a new live entertainment show, because you talked about live entertainment earlier on, and assuming high AI adoption and high AI literate crew, etc., what does it look like compared to what it might have looked like 5 years ago?
So that's another really interesting question. And I tell you, a little sort of anecdote is there. It's about a year or so ago, I was going to TV production companies and saying, you should really have a look at the software that people like the intelligence services have been using, which is to semantically analyze what people are saying and understand the underlying emotion. Actually, not just speech, but also facial recognition. Now, you might say that's really sinister technology, and I sort of agree with you, to be honest. But of course, that technology is now entirely available. Mark Zuckerberg's talked about it. In fact, he said he thinks it's one of the things that he wants Meta to excel in. And so what it means is that, let's say now, if I go to companies, I often find they're actually working on this, and people really are working on this, is you might take Love Island, for example, and you might add a data layer to it, rather like in a sort of NFL football match, where you get analytics across all the cast of Love Island, and it tells you who's looked at who more, who fancies who more, what the kind of prevailing verbal sentiment that they've sort of subconsciously expressed is, and so on and so forth. And so you actually end up with a really interesting additional dimension to reality television, which is now you get a kind of an interpretive access to it, and possibly an interactive one. And then there's one other really interesting thing for reality TV that no one's done yet, but people are working on, which is using AI agents. So let's say I was making Alan Titchmarsh's, that garden show that he makes, I can never remember the name of it, and he's redoing the garden of someone in sort of Worcester or something. But if there was an AI agent version of Alan Titchmarsh that ITV had created, I, at home in Brighton, could go and have a chat with that agent, send the agent a picture of my garden, and get Alan Titchmarsh's redesign of my garden during the show. And not only that, that redesign could then be shoppable. So I could say, I want that thing that you've just recommended and those flowers and what have you. And you would then do what's called an affiliate marketing model, which you guys know what it is, but I'll just explain it anyway. It's basically where you get a kind of kickback to the broadcaster for facilitating this transaction. And so what you'd have there is a kind of brand new revenue model, which sits completely outside broadcast guidelines because the transaction didn't happen on TV or in the TV ad break, but nonetheless allows a channel to monetize. And I think both of those things will happen. The data layer will happen, and particularly the AI agents will happen. I think you'll find that every character on every factual entertainment TV show ends up having an agent.
Fascinating.
And a different kind of agent.
Yeah.
Well, yes, a different kind of agent. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thinking of format then, so thinking of a format and distribution, and this is something that I know, I just watch Claire's face when I say this word in a minute. So audience and the attention economy, everyone, the sort of creator economy has moved on to the telly, the big telly. There are other things like wearables, for example. In your view, and given what Zuckerberg sort of is aiming for, which is everyone will be watching whatever entertainment they want on the street with a pair of spectacles. What's your view in terms of how will AI impact the delivery of content? Because we've spoken about the creation of content, but the delivery of content and meeting the demands of the next generation audiences.
Yeah, I think there's two different things there. There's the kind of algorithmic delivery, and then there's the kind of more societal question of whether we want to be in a society where everyone's watching kind of atomized content and there's no common content. So taking that second one first, I don't believe we want to live in that society. And my evidence for that would be Oasis. Here we have a situation where essentially an unlimited number of people, essentially globally across the rest of the world, all want to go and have the same live, shared, common experience. 80,000 people in Mexico City one week, in London, Wembley the next, and so forth. So I don't think there's any evidence that people no longer want shared experience. On the distribution, it's a really fascinating and actually very intellectually interesting area. So there were these kind of areas of machine learning. There's something called supervised learning. There's unsupervised learning. There's reinforcement learning. They all have these kind of subcategories: collaborative filtering, content filtering, and so forth. When you get into them, they're actually kind of philosophically really interesting, because what they all suggest is an understanding of how we truly access and share content, and always have done. So, for example, collaborative filtering would be Claire and I, but two people who don't know each other, but we both listen to Metallica, but Claire also listens to Primal Scream, so maybe Alex will like Primal Scream. That's called collaborative filtering, and that's what Spotify does every second. Content filtering is something different, and so forth. That technology is moving at incredible pace, and it's moving to be very context aware, because the me of Thursday night is not the same as the me of Saturday afternoon, when I might have a kid with me watching Netflix, and Thursday night I might want to watch a horror, and so forth. Socially aware, location aware. So we live in this kind of dynamic, three-dimensional, data-driven landscape now, and that's how content finds people. But even with that, there are incredible sort of concepts that I've never really thought of before. So there's a concept called grey sheep. Any idea what a grey sheep is? So I've got it written down, but grey sheep's a person who they don't have enough data on, and so this person can confound the algorithm because it can't figure out what to give them because it doesn't know enough about them, and so forth.
There's a life target: become a grey sheep.
Yeah, exactly. Become a grey sheep, But then I said that to some spook, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to be a grey sheep," and they went, "The day you become a grey sheep is the day you pop up on our radar," because the question is, why has he become?
Doesn't even exist. Picking up, sorry, on your collaborative filtering, Spotify now has. Do you know about the day list? They have this new function which basically you can look it up. Everybody has a day list, and it will give you a playlist that's targeted at you on this day at this time. So knowing, if this is what you would normally listen to on a Wednesday morning in terms of vibes, and they all have like super cool vibes names. But that's exactly that idea, that it's not just your playlist; it's the playlist of you on a Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. when you're doing the school run or whatever.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it sounds nice. But when you add kind of digital marketing to it, it becomes sinister, because you think, are they listening to me? And there's a familiar refrain and so forth. And then of course there's another whole dimension of this, which we haven't mentioned, is the reputational one. And so we all now have to concern ourselves with our reputation within large language models. And so I've had great fun with broadcasters with this. So you show them what the large language models think of them. And you might say, well, I don't care what a large language model thinks of me. I care what the Google PPC results think of me, because that's what I've been optimizing the last 20 years. And of course you do, because what's informing now the Google overview that people get is what the underlying model thinks of you. And there are loads of really funny stories of how people have managed to do what's called shilling attacks, which is basically change what large language models think of people. And that then sort of spreads out to inform the actual content that you get served to us. So we are going to be in this multidimensional universe where nothing is quite as it seems, and it's very difficult to understand how material is arriving with us, which is very different from the linear world of television in the 1980s, for example. And that's where we are now. And the final thing I'd say on this is Demis Hassabis, who's, again, you will know, but he's a British guy who founded a company called DeepMind, which was then bought by Google, and now he's head of Google's AI. He said he thinks the time is going to come quite soon where we all have our own defensive algorithm that mitigates all the other algorithms that are targeting us. And that's a really interesting idea. So I have kind of sitting on my head an algorithm that's filtering according to the parameters that I've set and not the parameters that Mark Zuckerberg has set. I think that's a really interesting thing. But this is the universe into which startups are now pitching themselves. It's fantastical. It's like the crazy chocolate factory, and
It's
it's kind of
very Black
fun.
Mirror.
Yeah, it is very Black Mirror. In fact, on that subject, my next book is about
Yeah.
quantum computing in the media, which is it's like what of Black Mirror is possible. That's essentially what I'm looking at, and the answer is a lot. But really interesting.
And that's going to be interesting. So we've got the proliferation of startups, but then you've got the legacy media companies consolidating. So if we fast forward, I'm sorry to say this, 3 years, 5 years, maybe. What's going to happen to the landscape? What's it going to look like? And in particular, through the lens of, say, an investor, as you've been looking at this, Alex. What does the land look like, and where are we going to see, AI companies, startups, consolidation, investments? What's the focus? It's a big question, but I'd love to get
Well, I
your
think
view.
I think with media, it's sort of plis chance in the sense that we've all exercised ourselves over the last 20 years or so with kind of who's the hot new company or what's the merger of this company with that company and so on and so forth. But it's always struck me that the commodity that really matters is actually not the company at all, but the product, but the actual creator, the showrunner, the writer, the Richard Osman, the person who ultimately creates stuff, and what corporate entity you put them within is kind of a secondary consideration. So I think we shouldn't worry too much about the corporation, but I think what I am interested in is like how will creators find and access markets, and I think the answer is that probably even more interestingly and prolifically than they have been in the kind of age of YouTube over the last 10 years. You could, if I was being optimistic, I would say there will be a kind of global democratization of storytelling, whereby someone who lives in the Ivory Coast has as much possibility of accessing a global audience with a great story they want to tell as someone whose parents worked in Hollywood and who got them into USC film school. And so you could have a kind of idealized world where actually there's a much wider opportunity for people to tell great stories. And I think that would only be a good thing. What do I think will happen in legacy media? I mean, I think you only have to kind of listen to the Town podcast to hear their sort of endless obsession with whether Paramount will merge with Warner's and so forth. And the truth is there probably will be great consolidation, whether it's that particular one, I don't know. And you'll probably end up with, a kind of oligopolistic situation where you have kind of 3 or 4 big media companies, but then beneath them, a very vibrant ecology of kind of self-starting, AI-powered, but paradoxically also very human creators.
And staying with that, sorry, Claire. Yeah, so staying with that, the individuals in the Ivory Coast, do they then therefore have their own identity? They play with identity. They don't need any agents because they've got their own agent, and they will rule the land themselves. And there'll be lots of individuals who are like that. We're all individuals. We're all human. We're all individuals. Is that how you foresee that? Just so I'm clear, because then there's no room for then investors. There's no room for private equity as an asset class, maybe even, because what would they be investing in? They don't need investment.
Yeah, so I think that they may not be investing in the raw material of the 1 minute clip or the 10-second clip, but they will be investing in, Netflix's version of Disneyland or some other new manifestation of how entertainment plays out in the kind of mass experience way. Because the kind of conversation that we haven't had, but equally could have had, is how interesting it is that synthetic media or synthetic powered media is growing so fast, and yet also live entertainment is growing so fast as well. And so you have a kind of big bang universe expansion going on. And actually, this is not an original thought of mine. I did an ITV conference, and the guy before me was a guy called Doug Shapiro, who's a very well-known American commentator, but almost word for word we had the same slide because we were both saying the same thing, like in real life experiences based around known brands will only grow, and you only have to look at the prolific success of the Oasis tour to see that, or any number of sporting events. And that crazy statistic, like, isn't the top 100 TV shows in America all NFL matches, for example? So look, I think I don't think creativity is dying at all. I just think that the media is in a process of permanent ferment, and that's not going to change. And starting businesses within that, and or flexing larger businesses, is fascinating to study, fascinating to do. It's only going to be fascinating over the next few years.
And I would love your optimistic view of the world to happen with any creator able to, find an audience. But we also have some people, not all, positively minded who are spending a lot of money pushing certain messages through all of these platforms. And we may get into a situation where everything we see and hear is actually being funded by some of this money and has a specific message, which is also terrifying. But we're not going to get into that because otherwise we'll be super depressed. I think we're running towards the end of our show, and I just wanted to go back to the reason we wanted to have you back on the show, which is your new book, which you've sort of touched on a little bit, but I will plug it because I can't wait to read it, and I think it's going to be fascinating. And it's called Entrepreneurship in Media and Entertainment: Hits and Value Creation. And when is it out?
It's pretty much out next week, I think, and it's actually already in. The reason it's already in university libraries as a digital copy, but I think it's out as a physical copy next week. Yeah, the book's very much about this. It's about how do we think about entrepreneurship in the media in the context of what the world is now like. Because actually, if you pick up standard entrepreneurial books, they describe a kind of halcyon past that really isn't where we are now. And so yeah, it's been fascinating to study, and it remains fascinating to study.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much for indulging my geekiness.
No, we're all geeks here. That's our trademark.
The eloquent geek, that's the dream. That was fantastic. That's absolutely fabulous. And I get to hear it again because I'm going to be editing it as well. Alex, that was absolutely brilliant. Look forward to the book coming out, and the best of luck with it. Everything you do, I'm sure we'll find an excuse to get you back on at some point. But until then, thanks ever so much. Brilliant questioning from Maureen and Claire. I thought excellent investigative journalism and a brilliant episode, all in all, end to end. Until the next time, it only remains for me to bid you bye-bye.